Okay, so kind of like the way that we did it with the end of chapter one, we did like a little mini review and a wrap up, if you will, analysis of some themes and something that was happening in chapter one that's kind of underlying. We're going to do the same thing here in chapter two because I think that there is something that's easily missed, and it has to do with speaking. It has to do with words. Take a good look here in chapter 2, starting at verse 3. He says, he's in the middle of his example here, talking about the kind of preferential treatment that the rich seem to be getting in some circles, or the warning against preferential treatment, favoring the rich for selfish motives, of course. He has here this phrase, you sit here at a good place, you sit down at my feet, right? This is someone saying, right? And if you pay attention to the one who wears fine clothing and say, you sit here in a good place, to the poor man you say, you stand over there or sit down at my feet. It's interesting to me that James talks about um, something that someone might say, which is evil, something that he will identify later as sin. But then he goes on with another set of sayings in verse 11. It says, for he who said, do not commit adultery, also said, do not murder. See, James is comparing what the sinner will say, or how the believer who's caught in a sin pattern, who's caught in a trap of thinking in a worldly way, right? Um, that believer has to always keep in mind that there's also the law, right? It's not just what I think, but there's also what God thinks. It's not just what I say, but there's also what God says. And if I'm not careful with my words, I'm going to mess up, not just in my own life, if you will, but I'm going to mess up because I'm going to have my words running in conflict against God's words. His solution, though, is in verse 12. We'll come back to that. But take a look at verse 15. He does it again. If a brother or sister is poorly clothed and lacking in daily food, and one of you says to them, go in peace, be warm and filled. Then he brings up another person. But someone will say in verse 18, you have faith and I have works, right? Well, again, James is setting, I think, for us a really good example. Verse 23, it says, and the scripture was fulfilled that says. Take note that two halves of the chapter, right? In the first half, you have someone saying something, and James compares that with the law, right? He shows how they're running contra each other, one against the other. And again, in verse 14 through 26, you have another set of something that someone will say, and then comparing that with what the scripture says. And I love it because we know, right, that James is about to go into the whole question of taming the tongue, right, which I think is probably the little title or heading that's at the top of most New Testament chapters for chapter 3, um, taming the tongue. But see how he's kind of easing into it, right? Because I don't think we have an example of something someone says in chapter 1, or actually we do. Let no one say when he is tempted, right? But then he doesn't give the same kind of comparison and contrast with the scripture, which I think is interesting because he does it here in chapter 2, and it's going to dovetail perfectly going into chapter 3 because the answer is not to zip up. The answer is not to be quiet. The answer is not to not say a word. The answer is in verse 12. Speak and so act as those who are to be judged under the law of liberty. That's the answer, right? Let the words of my mouth and the meditation of my heart be acceptable in thy sight, O Lord, my rock and my redeemer, right? Make sure that my words are matching up with what God has already said. And that's the answer. That's the answer. That's the precursor, the underlying precursor that's throughout chapter 2, that will lead us into, I think, a better appreciation of what James has to say in chapter 3. All right. So that's my little mini analysis here of little structural patterns that I think are in 2 that are not in 1. It makes it a little different. So we're going to jump into chapter 3 very soon. I'll probably do a video tomorrow afternoon or something. So it should be about Wednesday for the latest. And we'll go from there. All right. God bless. Thanks for the comments and all of the interesting chatter in the Google Classroom. Looking forward to continuing that and going into chapter 3. All right. Peace.